Australia experienced an age of prosperity and growth funded primarily by foreign loans. By the time the Great Depression started, Australia had accumulated huge debts. In 1929, the Black Tuesday stock market crash marked the beginning of the Great Depression. Due to the Depression, no one offered new loans to Australia, but the government was still obligated to repay the existing loans. Australia relied on the export of its primary produce to repay its loans, and the falling value of exports made the debt problem worse. In 1928, Australia's exports were worth $1,036 million, whereas they were only worth $710 million in 1932. Australia's government had the difficult task of repaying its loans while minimising the effect of the Great Depression in Australia. A director of the Bank of England, Sir Otto Niemeyer, was invited by the federal government to give his advice, which was for the government to adopt a deflationary policy. He believed that the government had borrowed excessively prior to the Great Depression, and that the government would have to manage its budget, reduce spending, and repay its debt. At a meeting of the state and federal governments at Melbourne in 1930, they agreed to follow Niemeyer's recommendations. So Niemeyer's arrival and the government implementing Niemeyer's advice caused some public unrest. He was viewed as an outsider, telling Australians what they should do.
James Henry Scullin, the Prime Minister of Australia during the early parts of the Great Depression, started the Grow More Wheat campaign. He encouraged farmers to grow more wheat to increase exports. He promised to pay the farmers for their wheat. However, he was unable to convince neither the Senate nor the Commonwealth Bank to support his plans financially. Even if he had support, the plan would not have been successful, as Europe, Australia's chief export market, was also experiencing the Great Depression, and many countries' tries were imposing heavy import tariffs. These would have made it very difficult for Australia to find a market to export the wheat to. This plan, along with the government requesting Niemeyer's advice, showed that ultimately the Australian government was inexperienced and unable to effectively deal with the Great Depression.
Edward Granville Theodore, commonly known as Ted Theodore, was the treasurer of the Labor government led by James Scullin. He proposed an inflationary policy, increasing spending instead of cutting it. He planned to put $36 million into the economy, creating jobs and making life easier for Australians. However, he was unable to pass a bill through the Senate required to finance his plan.
Another plan was proposed by the Premier of New South Wales, John Thomas Lang, commonly known as Jack Lang. He proposed the Lang Plan. The Lang Plan was an inflationary policy, similar to the Theodore Plan. However, it also required repudiation, refusing to repay Australia's loans. This was seen as dishonourable, and no one in power at the time accepted it. The Lang Plan was one of the key events that led to the dismissal of Jack Lang. It was in the support of his plan and the repudiation that Jack Lang went and robbed his own bank. Jack Lang withdrew all the funds from the New South Wales Treasury to prevent the federal government from claiming the funds. This was one of the main events that led to the Governor of New South Wales, Sir Philip Game, dismissing Jack Lang, a very significant moment in Australia's political history.
In 1931, the state premiers and the federal government met and agreed on a plan known as the Premier's Plan. They agreed on a deflationary plan that required all spending to be cut by 20%. This freed up money to pay off the debt. However, cutting public spending made life harder for Australians as unemployment rose, reaching 29% at its peak in 1932. The Premier's Plan, the Lang Plan, caused deep divides within the Labor Party. Labor split into Lang Labor, led by Jack Lang, the Conservatives, led by Joseph Lyon, and the mainline Australian Labor Party. Lyon broke away from the Labor Party and founded the United Australian Party, which governed Australia under Lyon from 1932 to 1939. The United Australia Party later morphed into the current Liberal Party of Australia. Lang Labor mostly dissolved after Jack Lang was dismissed from office. Many of the decisions made by those in power in the 1930s still have repercussions today. The split in the Labor Party caused by the Lang Plan and the Premier Plan started a chain of events that led to the formation of the Liberal Party of Australia, which has survived to this day. The federal government requesting Niemeyer to come and give his advice, and the likely failure of James Scullin's Grow More Wheat campaign showed that the federal government at the time was inexperienced and for the most part incompetent and unable to effectively deal with the Depression. In 1932, the Australian economy began to improve. However, this was probably not because of any policies the Australian government had implemented, but rather because the global economy was improving and Australia's economy was as well, simply as a result of the global improvement.